Once again, my name is Todd Eby. I'll be the moderator for this webinar. I just want to repeat a few things. All participants are muted, and we ask that you keep your camera disabled during the webinar. The chat box is available for questions. They can be entered into any time during the webinar, and the questions, there will be a Q&A session after the presentation. And a reminder that this webinar is being recorded. We'll get started with the webinar, and Mike Appleby is the supervisor of groundwater. He's our first presenter in the webinar, and we will have Bill Miller, a geologist and technical reviewer in the groundwater section, also presenting for the webinar.
Okay, thanks, Todd. We'll go ahead and get started with this. My name is Mike Appleby. I am the groundwater supervisor, as Todd said. And we're going to get started with the first part of this webinar series, the alternative hydrogeologic evaluation and impacts to other users. All right, the webinar series that we're going to start off with today is going to be of three parts. Part one is the AHE process and impacts to other users. Part two is going to be evaluating sustainability and impacts to the environment. So those are between this webinar today and the next webinar. We're going to hit the three principal risk factors that are identified in the AHE policy. And then part three is going to be to demonstrate how to complete some of the forms, as well as development and implementation of action plans, including the voluntary action plans that the Commission provides to projects during the Public Water Supply Assistance Program. So today we're going to have this webinar be about 60 minutes. Since we had a little bit of technical difficulty there in the beginning to get this started, we might have to extend just a little bit, but we'll try to stick to that schedule as best we can. We're going to have about 45 minutes of the presentation to introduce the concepts of the AHE, provide the foundations on which the AHE was built, discuss data gaps and the principal risk factors, and also then Bill's going to get into a detailed description of how to evaluate the principal risk factor of impacts to other users. And as Todd mentioned, we're going to have a question and answer session at the end of this. We expect it'll be about 15 minutes, and you can use the chat feature to ask your questions. You can do that at any time, but some of the questions you ask early on may be answered later on. We will stay here as long as it takes to answer all of the questions that you have. So don't hesitate to put as many questions in there as you have. We realize that this is a new policy, and there's probably several questions that will be applicable after today. So this is a new policy. It's the Alternative Hydrogeologic Evaluation Policy. We are replacing what was the Aquifer Testing Plan policy, or the Aquifer Testing Plan Waiver policy. As you may recall, the old policy consisted of just a couple of paragraphs in the aquifer testing guidance that was approved in 2007. So that was a fairly old policy and really needed to be reworked and redeveloped. So in September of 21, we were able to pass this new policy as well as the attendant regulations to make it effective, and it is currently in place. During the October webinar, we talked about revising the aquifer testing waiver request form to recognize the AHE, or the Alternative Hydrogeologic Evaluation. That form was modified basically to remove the word waiver and add AHE in its place because we needed to get something up and running in place in time for the new regulations and policy to be effective. So there really weren't very many changes at that time, but we did promise then that we would be working on a new form that would incorporate more of the policies and more closely align with the policy of the AHE. So we've done that in that time, and the new form went live this week. So I'm sure that we have a few bugs to work out. So as you're working through that, if you happen to come across any of those bugs, please contact me and let me know about them, and we'll fix them as soon as we can. If we're not able to fix them, we'll do what IT suggests and then call them features and figure out how to work around them. You can find the AHE form on our website, and you can work through what we call a functional sample template, which is available there, and anybody can enter information into that and to work through and basically evaluate the entire form without actually starting one that would be eventually submitted to the commission. The only comment that I have about that is to caution you that anything that you enter into that form will be deleted at the end of the day, but it's also visible to other people while you are working on that functional template. So please don't put any sensitive information in the functional sample template, and save that for the AHE form that you're going to work on with the project sponsor. So Drew got into a little bit of why we created the AHE, and I wanted to build on some of those things. And he talked a lot about some of the things that went into the development of this. And a lot of what we did in creating the AHE policy was really building on experiences that we'd had over the years in reviewing waivers. Now, I'd mentioned earlier that the waiver policy was a couple of paragraphs in the 2007 offer testing guidance. And when that was originally passed, we didn't really expect that many projects would have the type of data at that time that would support a waiver. So we didn't encourage projects to go down the waiver path all that often. And most of the time when we got a waiver early on, that was a renewal of a project that was approved in the late 70s or early 80s, there was very little hydrogeologic evaluation completed. There might not have even been a test done at that time. And most of the waivers that we were getting around 2008 and 2010 and 11 were essentially a couple of paragraphs that said, please let us renew our previous approval at the same rate that we had before. And there was no justification provided for it. So we weren't able to approve those types of waiver requests. But since then, waiver requests have gotten better. We've been able to better provide guidance through Public Water Supply Assistance Program presentations and direct work with project sponsors. And we've seen the quality of the waivers go up. The commission staff has learned better how to review waivers. And through all that process and all that learning, we've been able to develop this AHE policy that really encompasses all of what we've learned over the last 10 years or so about how to review and provide guidance for waivers. The benefit of this is that it's now providing a good guidance for staff as well as project sponsors. It eliminates a lot of the uncertainty that projects had about developing a waiver. One of the complaints that we often heard was that a project was concerned that they would work through the waiver process, spend the time and the money to complete that, only at the end to have it denied and then have to go through the offer testing plan. Well, throughout our history of reviewing waivers, we've approved more than 90% of them. So that was unfounded, but certainly heard criticism of the waiver process, and we wanted to rectify that with this AHE policy. We also wanted to dispel some of the experiences that some of the early project sponsors and consultants had with working through the waiver process, where I had some consultants tell me that they would never do a waiver again because of how difficult and time consuming it was, and because they weren't certain about what the process would result in at the end. So we think we've corrected all of those things. We have eliminated a waiver of regulation by building the AHE process into the regulation. So those are good improvements. And then we're also recommending that projects utilize to the maximum extent possible any existing data that they have that could be relevant to help support the AHE. So after all that, you're probably wondering what an AHE really is. Well, it does replace the former waiver process, and it is still very similar to that process. We think that it's probably an improvement over what was previously being done. We also feel that it's going to be a fairly intuitive process where projects are going to begin to focus on what matters, and they're going to be able to utilize more of a risk-based approach to focus their project on data collection for the things that really matter to that project. So, one of the things that we look at is at a screening level of being able to remove some of the risk factors that we're going to talk about here shortly. And how do you do that? Well, sometimes it's just by looking at high-level information. And some of the easiest things, and one of the reasons we're going to start out with reviewing impacts of other users today is because that is a more basic element of the risk factor, and it's probably the easiest one to work through. It's a good concept to start off with. But one of the things that Bill will talk about will be looking at something as simple as the area of influence. And if you control the entire area of influence and there's no other users within that, that can be as simple as providing documentation for that. And that essentially screens that risk factor out of the process right away. So you probably also wonder when an AHE is required. We require an AHE when the aquifer testing plan approval requirement of 806.12 has not been met. So the way to try to assess whether or not you've already met 806.12 is to simply look at your docket. Many dockets, including more modern dockets, will indicate very clearly within the aquifer testing section that the test was completed in accordance with a commission-approved plan or something similar to that language. But some of the older dockets may not say that. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have not met the requirements of 806.12. It just means that we might need to do a little bit more research to determine if that's happened or not. So look through your correspondence folders and we'll look through ours. And if you can find something that we can't, we can certainly accept that and provide a determination if 806.12 has been met. There have been a couple of project sponsors already that have been able to provide correspondence that we didn't find in our files to demonstrate that they had in fact met a 806.12 and that they did not have to go through the AHE process. And as always, please contact staff if you have any questions about whether or not this applies to you. The one thing that I would say that even if the AHE process does not need to be completed, it does serve as a good guide for you in completing step 2 of the renewal process, which is the hydrogeologic evaluation which is the groundwater withdrawal application. So even if the AHE doesn't apply, it can serve as a good guide for how you would still complete the hydrogeologic portion of the groundwater withdrawal application. So the first steps of completing an AHE is to see what you already have. If you have the results of a historic test, that's a great place to start. So you want to look to see what kind of test was completed, whether it was a single well test, if it was done at a constant rate, if any other features were monitored, such as springs or streams or wetlands nearby, and compile all that data and compartmentalize it based on the principal risk factors, which I'll talk about with the next slide. You also should develop a site conceptual model where you're looking at the hydrogeologic setting to evaluate what is likely to happen, whether or not there's potential confining layers that are going to limit impacts to shallower features. If there might be 2 aquifers and most of the residential wells are completed in the shallow aquifer compared to a deep aquifer that the production well is utilizing. Then you're going to evaluate each of the risk factors through a series of screenings to determine what additional evaluation, if any, is necessary. And as part of that, as you work through that screening process, you need to document some of those findings so that you can provide that to us and we can make a determination whether or not we agree that that risk factor has been adequately met. And it's only if you can't screen those risk factors out that we're looking for you to collect additional data. And we want to make sure that it is targeted data. One of the biggest differences between the aquifer testing plan process and the AHE process is that with an aquifer testing plan, we don't know a whole lot about how the project is going to affect the area. But with a project that's already existing, we should have some knowledge and some understanding of what is going to happen or what has happened in the past, and be able to use that to target specific monitoring locations. Instead of monitoring all 12 residential wells that are nearby, maybe we can only monitor 1 or 2, and that significantly can reduce the costs of completing an AHE. And when we're looking to do that, it's through operational monitoring and testing. It's not through the development of a commission-approved plan. The commission will complete a voluntary action plan for some projects that are eligible for the Public Water Supply Assistance Program. And they are free to implement that plan as they see fit. But then projects can also develop their own action plans that they can utilize instead of going through a commission approved process. If at any time you have questions on developing your own plan, staff is available to assist you and provide some opinions and provide some guidance on what you're finding and how to possibly complete what needs to be done and identify those data gaps and how to fill them. So I've talked a little bit already about the principal risk factors. And there's three of them that we're concerned about. It's sustainability, impacts other users, and impacts the environment. Bill's going to get into the impacts to other users, so I'm not going to talk about that very much. Sustainability and impacts the environment tend to be the more difficult risk factors to deal with. Sustainability, according to the commission, is the ability of the well and the aquifer to produce the requested quantity. We've actually provided a definition of this within the AHE policy. That's the first time that the commission has ever defined what sustainability is with our perspective in mind. If you go to a Webster's dictionary and look up sustainability, it often has a caveat in there that has to do with the other two risk factors. But to compartmentalize this information and the review, it's easier to pull sustainability out as its own to evaluate whether the well or the aquifer can produce that quantity. The things that we're looking for with this are going to be the groundwater availability analysis, 90-day projections for water levels. It's residual drawdown analyses, T over T prime analyses, and things like that to assess whether or not groundwater mining is going to occur and if there's sufficient recharge to support the requested withdrawal. The impacts of the environment is often a difficult one to deal with because historical tests tended to not have any environmental monitoring completed during those tests. So if the test wasn't a single well test, it may have monitored one or two monitoring wells nearby, which may be good to help assess impacts to other users, but it often doesn't speak very well to impacts to the environment. So, and even if it did, we still need to make sure that there's no new rare, threatened, or endangered species within the area. Need to be current on the water quality designations and make sure there's not going to be a degradation of those standards. So there's often a data gap that needs to be assessed with this. So the screenings that we've been talking about, and Bill is going to talk about it as well as we'll talk about it during the next webinar to get into some specific examples for each of the risk factors. But again, it should be fairly intuitive. What you're finding as you're screening through the projects needs to be described and documented. And you may need to develop more than one line of evidence to prove or sufficiently demonstrate that something has been sufficiently screened out. And the example that always comes to mind is when there's a significant clay layer or confining layer that a lot of projects and consultants will say, well, there's a confining layer between the production well and this wetlands that's near the well. Therefore, there's not going to be any kind of impact. So they would want to screen it out at that level. And that very well may be the case, except that we would need to know how continuous that clay layer is, because not all clay layers are built the same. Not all confining layers are as confining as we would expect them to be. And there may be some communication between those two. So you say, well, what would be an additional line of evidence? Well, if you have a water level in the test well that is 20 or 30 feet below that other feature, that would certainly be a good line of evidence, and that would greatly support screening something like that out. However, if the water levels are fairly coincident, and that may not be enough, just saying that the clay layer is present may not be enough to screen that out, and some additional work may be necessary. So data gaps is something that we've talked about in prior webinars, and I wanted to bring this up because it's going to be a topic of discussion throughout this entire process. The screening levels that we're doing are intended to identify what data gaps may exist, and then you have to figure out how to fill in those data gaps, whether it's through some kind of targeted monitoring through operational testing, or if you need to look to see if there's other historical data that might be available that, you know, maybe wasn't previously available or you forgot about. So there could be some things that are there to fill in some of these data gaps that don't always include testing, but more often than not, that's probably where you're going to end up, is that some kind of targeted test is necessary. Some of the common data gaps that we see are groundwater availability analyses. For older approvals, groundwater availability was not considered. So that original approval might not have ever taken into consideration how much recharge may be available within the contributing groundwater basin. And also another data gap that is associated with groundwater availability is a difference between a topographic basin and a structural basin. So the data gap here could be filled in by providing some cross sections that demonstrate what the structural basin should be, or it may be that you would need to do some operational testing to define that the area of influence actually extends across those topographic boundaries and will incorporate some of that structure into it. The groundwater availability analysis that we do is not an exact science. It is a desktop study, but it is one of the things that we do rely on to evaluate whether or not there is a potential problem. Another thing that tends to be a common data gap is the historical testing. It's often a single well test, or it may have been done at a variable rate. Variable rate tests especially are common data gaps where someone started out at one rate and then steadily increased. And it's a lot more difficult to make projections using variable rate tests. So typically what we're looking to see for that is some kind of constant rate test. Even if it's a single well test, that still may be useful in helping to evaluate sustainability of the withdrawal, especially when you're able to combine it with some water level or withdrawal data. So even though a historical test may not meet current standards, it may be sufficient to help address one or more of the risk factors. So we can look at what we used to do with some of these old tests was say, well, you know, it really doesn't match our standards, so you're going to need to go through an aquifer test. Well, over time, we've learned that there are ways to utilize some of that existing data in conjunction with other information. Some of the other information that we would look for is this historical operations data. So hopefully projects have been collecting water level data. There was a period of time where we told projects that they could stop collecting that, or at least stop reporting it to us. And so that meant that many projects stopped collecting. Since then, we have reinstituted those water level requirements, and a lot of projects now have a sufficient period of record to help support a requested quantity, and possibly also to compare current withdrawal and water level data to that historical test to help confirm that the historical test is adequately predicting the results and the conditions that we're seeing today. However, sometimes what you'll see is that the historical test may have predicted a water level of 90 feet, but current operations at half of the tested rate are producing water levels of 90 feet. So there would be some kind of problem there. There's a disconnect there, and that's a data gap that would end up needing to be filled in through some kind of operational testing. Or it's possible that that historical test simply isn't valid anymore, and the operational data is really a better predictor of what's happening in the aquifer. And the final common data gap that we often deal with is the environmental resource evaluation. So this is heavily dependent on the setting. And this is often where we hear projects say that they've been doing this forever, so they should be allowed to continue to do it. And in many cases, that may be the case. But there are problems. There are some projects that are causing significant adverse impacts, and they may not even be aware of it, or what they're requesting for the renewal, and considering what they've already done, is nowhere near how they've been operating. So as an example, there's projects that maybe they were operating at 1.5 million gallons a day, and they want 4 to 5 million gallons a day as a renewal. They were previously approved for that quantity, but they've never actually operated at that rate. And existing operations may be causing some impact. So we'd have to evaluate whether or not allowing an increase there would be acceptable. So just because someone has been doing something for a long time doesn't mean that they've been doing it right or that it's still acceptable. But we do try to make some allowances for existing projects. So as you're working through that data gap, this is a good one where talking to commission staff through this process is very important, because this is one of the more common issues that we come across, and it can be one of the more complex to deal with. So with this, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Bill Miller, who is a geologist within the groundwater program. So with that, go ahead, Bill.
Okay. Good afternoon. Like Mike and Todd said, I'm Bill Miller. I'm a geologist in the project review groundwater area here at the commission. I'm the one that gets to see your submittals first. So what we'd like to do is go ahead and talk about this new process, the AHE process, and how it might apply to how it applies to one of these risk factors. And the risk factor we're going to look at right now is okay. Okay. It is impacts to other users. Like Mike said, we're going to look at sustainability impacts the environment here in the next session. We're a couple slides ahead. Go to the next slide. Okay, let's start by talking about impacts to other users. There's two concepts here. The one is, when we're talking about a impact to another user, we're talking about a significant adverse impact. And that's a fairly nondescript term, difficult to define. But in general, what we're talking about is an impact to a resource, whether it's a well or a spring, that interferes with the normal use of that resource. So if it's a residential well that's near the production well, of course, there's going to probably be some drawdown that's going to be experienced. But is that drawdown enough to adversely impact that person's use of that resource, that well? Going into that a little bit more detail, it's dependent on the characteristics of the other source. You could have two wells next to the production well, equal distance away. One well is 200 feet deep and it's got a 30-foot static. The other well's 50 feet deep and has that same 30-foot static. If both wells draw down about 5 feet when they're normally operated by the property owner, and the withdrawal from the production well is going to add another 5 feet of drawdown, the impacts of that 200-foot deep well are not going to be felt by the user. However, the impacts to that 50-foot deep well is basically taking that available water column and cutting it in half. And that's, during the time of testing. The other thing you have to consider is there is expected seasonal variation, and that can be addressed by, again, looking at some of your existing data. If you've been collecting water levels, see what the magnitude of seasonal variations are and what you might expect to see in some of those wells near to you. The other thing I want to talk about is we use, and you'll hear us talk about 90-day projections, and those are really used in two ways. The first is in determining the area of influence. Whenever we do a 72-hour test, we project those numbers out to 90 days with no recharge and use that to establish what the area of influence is. We also look at individual well drawdowns on that same basis, projecting drawdowns out 90 days as a worst case kind of approach to assessing what potential impacts might be. Now, how does the AHE next? Okay, how does the AHE impact this assessment of impacts of other users? We're going to go through that. Couple things, it's a series, like Mike said, it's a series of screenings, starting out high level, intuitive approach to begin with, using best professional judgment. Series of screenings with increasing detail and data requirements as you move into the process, with the goal of evaluating that potential impact. Sometimes that potential impact can be assessed and evaluated sufficiently with existing data. Everything screens out. Sometimes it results in an indication that maybe some testing is required, but the goal is to limit that testing, like Mike said, target that testing to answer the questions that the risk-based approach, the AHE, has identified in addressing the impacts of other users. First of those is area of influence, and what we'll usually look at on a default level is a 2,500 feet radius from the well. Of course, it's setting dependent. If you have an anisotropic aquifer, I can never say that word, that's going to affect the shape and maybe the extent of your area of influence. Transmissivity of the aquifer is also going to potentially affect the size of the area of influence. If you have a lower transmissivity, you expect a smaller area of influence. If you're in a sand and gravel, you expect a broad and flat cone, which could result in a pretty good size area of influence, but of limited impact. Some of the other considerations you can use to try to evaluate what that area of influence is historical testing, if it actually did incorporate some monitoring points. Analog wells, if you have something that's a similar depth, similar withdrawal, if you have multiple wells in the system and you've done some testing on one of the other wells, you can certainly look at that. One of the things I want to stress is as we're looking at the AHE process and the risk-based approach, what we're really looking for is multiple lines of evidence, multiple reasons to support what the assumptions are and what the determinations are as you're going through the evaluation. And when we talk about identifying the other users, there's a couple ways to do that. I'm sure you're all familiar with the PAGWIS. New York recently completed their New York DEC well survey information that's available in GIS. Our own portals that we have on our website that show our approved well sources, which can be commercial, residential, or commercial industrial type withdrawals that you may want to be aware of. The other thing that we look at or you should look at, is distribution area extent of the public water supply system. Inquire as to whether they have tap-in ordinances, those kinds of things. Reconnaissance. We go out for test plan site meetings, and one of the things that we'll commonly almost always do at the end of those meetings is take a drive around the area and just look in the yards and see, are there wells there? We've identified a number of areas where wells existed where none were assumed to be. And then a source inventory. This is as you're getting into that layered screening approach. It may indicate that you really need to take a look at, there are wells in the area. Let's see if we can gather data on those wells to identify which ones that may be more susceptible to that adverse impact. And you can see on the picture there, we've got several things going on. We're going to take a look at that in a little bit closer view. This is a section right along the New York-Pennsylvania border. The border kind of runs coincident with the highway there. You can see the Paguas wells are shown in that light green. The New York DEC wells are kind of that pale orange. That blue area you see in the middle of the photograph is a public water supply distribution area. You can see there are a number of wells within that distribution area. Now that could be a water line was laid after the wells were drilled. So those wells may exist, they may not. That's probably something that would be worthwhile to at least take a drive through the area, see what it looks like. As anyone who's ever used the Paguas data set, I haven't looked at the New York data set in any kind of detail, but I've used Paguas for years. It's only as good as the information that was supplied. The information was supplied by well drillers. Not to say they don't know what's going on, but some are better than others. So the data can be a little incomplete. If you look down in the lower left-hand corner, you'll notice there's a housing development area down there that have, well, I don't know, 30, 40 homes there, and there's a grand total of 6 wells shown. I would imagine that each one of those wells or each one of those properties has a well. So the caveat is don't use the online database systems as a starting point, but not an end point in your investigation. And then we're going to look at potential impacts. And again, it's all hydrogeologic setting dependent. The anisotropic aquifer or a sand and gravel aquifer, the direction of the wells you're examining may be as important as the distance, or even more important than the distance. Is that well along strike, or is it perpendicular to strike? Use the data. A lot of times you go into one of these projects and it's a standalone project, but there was data generated when that well was originally sited and drilled. Was there a fracture trace analysis done? That might be something that would be worthwhile to look at to develop your conceptual model on how groundwater is moving. Identify those areas that may be of more concern than others. Water bearing zones, the source location. Those are all things that you want to look at when you're trying to assess potential for impacts to those private water supplies. The vertical horizontal barriers. Mike talked about the traditional. Well, we're in the buried sand and gravel aquifer. There's a clay layer at surface, so we're good. That might be. But it might be worthwhile to take a look at some of those water levels. Like Mike said, in those wells, are they dissimilar enough to show that they're 2 separate flow systems, or are they really behaving as one continuous flow system? And I wanted to bring that up too. We're talking about impacts to other users. That's also important information we'll talk about next week with the impacts to the environment, to try to show that disconnect between what's going on in the subsurface as opposed to the near surface. And again, we look at 90-day withdrawals for those potential impacts to the individual supplies. So let's talk about the screening processes themselves. Start out, with an intuitive high-level screening. It's almost, and I say almost, a desktop screening exercise. There should still be some in-depth, or you still should look at the data that you have. Use conservative assumptions, and by that, you look at the worst case. You don't try to do best case to screen out. And the whole goal of the AHE process is not to screen out necessarily. It's to identify those areas that need some better or more in-depth evaluation. It may end up that you have sufficient data. There's no data gap there. The evaluation can be completed, but it's not a screening where you just say, okay, we've made these assumptions and we're good. So some of the considerations, if you're going to do a high-level screening, if you have a well-defined area of influence, you have a really good idea of what area you're considering in the evaluation. Your well yield request for withdrawal, is it a 50-gallon a minute well, or is it a 1,000,000 gallon a minute well, or 1,000 gallon a minute well. What? You know, is a hydrogeologic setting well defined? Getting back to kind of those clay layers, do we really know what's going on in the subsurface? And then the absence of other users, and that's really the easiest situation. Let's look at this well. There's a well there. It's shown by the yellow dot in the middle of the red circle. There we go. It's in a, I forget off the top of my head what the yield of this well was, but I think it's on the order of like a 25, 35 gallon a minute well. So you'd expect a fairly small area of influence, probably confined to the valley. Look at Paguas. There's nothing there. There's one well that's up on the hillside across. A couple, I think there's another well down in the valley on the other side of the ridge. And some background, the authority actually owns the property of the valley where the well is. They have a reservoirs there as well. And then beyond that is state forest land. This is a case where at this, you know, this high level screening, good. Yeah. Sorry, there are some technical difficulties there. So you don't have the easy case. So you got to go look at doing some refined screening, some targeted screening on what's going on. And again, this is going to involve a little bit increased data collection. It may involve a source water inventory or a survey, which is simply a collection of what data you can get on the wells that are in the area. Again, you may focus depending on the hydrogeologic setting, some other issues, using again your professional interpretation on what areas to target, but you may need to collect some information so you can make that individual well assessment as to potential impacts. The process I'm going through here today is rather general. You know, we tried not to make the policy a flow chart. We wanted to give some ability for professional judgment to be used in this process. Just want to throw out a couple of examples of you know, taking some care in what the assumptions you make and how you go about. This is a well, these two wells were actually run through the aquifer test plan process. You can see the two wells in the center, the yellow dots. The orange and red circles are those default 2,500 foot radii around the well. The magenta line is the actual area of influence that was determined from testing. So you can see it's you know, considerably smaller than what the default was. And again, the blue is the public water supply distribution area. You would assume everything in there is probably supplied by public water. However, you'll see the blue and the green and the red circles. Those are all existing residential wells in that area there to the northwest of the production wells. That whole neighborhood is served by private wells. So the point is just getting that data. Okay, here's a distribution area from the public water supplier, and yeah, we have a tapping ordinance. It's still, if there's development, if there's areas where there might be wells, it still is a good idea to take a look at those areas and double check and make sure that there are, that the wells, that the houses, the properties are indeed on the public water supply and are not being served by wells. And part of that could be the public water supply could look at billing records as opposed to just an area on the map and identify properties that are not served or not currently being billed for water. And this is another one, same idea. We won't spend a lot of time on it. This is a well that that was tested. This is one, you can see the blue. It's almost the entire map. The wells, the yellow dot in the center. When this was submitted, the project sponsor and the consultant said, you know, it's all served. There's nothing out there. And we went out for the site meeting for the aquifer test plan, and took a half an hour and drove around a couple of the roads. And there wasn't, you know, there weren't a lot of roads to drive, but we drove them all, and we spotted a half dozen, 8 wells just in that short period of time. Come to find out that there were significant number of wells that existed in that area that we ended up monitoring. There's a few of those during the testing. So I guess the caveat or the takeaway is to make the assumptions, but verify your assumptions. Be careful with going too far down the path without really checking and making sure that what you've got is correct. The other thing I want to talk about was historical use versus previously approved and requested withdrawals. I hate to say it, but I've seen waivers submitted that are basically 3 lines, like Mike said, that say, we're approved for $500,000 a day. We're only asking for $500,000 a day, and no one's ever complained. That might be one of those lines of evidence that could be used. It's by no means the only line of evidence you could submit. But the other issue with that is, was the well actually used at or near its approved withdrawal? If you have you're approved for $500,000 and you're requesting $500,000, but you've only ever used 200,000, then you can really only make a statement that no one's complained at 200,000. We're going to get into this in a little bit greater detail in the third issue of this series, when we start talking about voluntary action plans and some of the things we look at for those. And again, we're looking at the use of those other sources. So you have to take into account how much drawdown is there based on their use, as well as what drawdown might be felt from the source, from the production well. And seasonal variability is something you definitely want to take a look at when you're trying to assess impacts to individual supplies. And like Mike said, all the great work you do is meaningless if it's not documented. You should submit enough information that I, as the reviewer, can come to the same conclusion that you came to in writing the report. So all the assumptions, the basis of the assumptions, the justification for the assumptions should be listed. All pertinent collected information, if there's a source inventory done, the public water supply distribution area, any pertinent correspondence, any of that work that may have been done prior to this, like I said, the fracture trace analysis or something of that nature, you know, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So collect that information as you're going through and make sure you include that in your submittal. And then as the final slide, just want to talk a little bit about the approach. It uses existing data, and the goal is to use existing data to evaluate the potential for significant adverse impacts to existing water users. If that existing data isn't sufficient to fully evaluate that potential impact, then that identifies a data gap. As we talked about data gaps, the process is identification and then filling those in. The goal or the benefit of the AHE process is hopefully that some of the work that goes into identifying that data gap also results in a targeted data collection through some operational testing, typically with some additional monitoring that addresses those questions and enables a full evaluation on those potential impacts. And with that, I think Mike's going to bring up some summary slides, and then we'll have questions.
All right, thanks, Bill. So yeah, as he mentioned, there now is a good time to start entering any questions that you may have in the chat feature. While we are finishing up this webinar, there's only a couple slides left here. So go ahead and enter any questions you may have, and then we'll get to them in a few minutes. So I just wanted to mention the additional resources that are available. We have quite a collection of fact sheets and policies, as well as online functional sample templates available for your use to help guide you through the process, as well as contacting any of us that are involved in these webinars to answer any questions you may have afterwards. We're always available to answer your questions. Please don't hesitate to ask. So as a reminder, coming up next, we have an AHE process evaluating sustainability and impacts the environment. That'll happen at the end of February. That one's going to be a particularly useful one because it's going to be all the types of things that Bill talked about for impacts to other users, but we're going to talk about it regarding sustainability and impacts the environment. So it's building on those other two principal risk factors that are identified in the AHE policy. And then that third webinar, again, is going to be about completing a form. Just going to, hopefully you'll have had a chance to work through a couple of examples of functional sample templates between now and then, and you can come armed with any questions you may have. And then also we're going to get into some of the specifics of the voluntary action plans that we've been developing at the commission because we think that they are very useful in helping to provide some guidance and examples of how you should go about identifying data gaps and filling those data gaps for the projects that you're working on. And finally, we're looking at doing a classroom style or possibly a virtual AHE workshop that'll probably be a smaller venue with certainly fewer people, whether it's virtual or not, because we want to provide some more hands-on examples about working through some of the action plans, helping you to identify data gaps. We'll take some real projects and work through them. We'll probably take some of the voluntary action plans that we've already been working on, break them down a little bit, provide you with some of those pieces, and let you work through some of those parts to see how, see what you come up with, and then show you what we came up with at the end of that. So this last slide here is just a summary of what we've been talking about. We've gone through a lot of this stuff in a fair amount of detail today. But the one thing that I do want to continue to remind people to do is to set up pre-application meetings with staff. That's something we do encourage. We are always willing to talk with people, projects, consultants about this process. Review the information that we have on our website. One of the fact sheets that I think that is so important for you to look at is the groundwater process renewal fact sheet, because it defines the two-step process that we didn't really talk too much about today, because we're really only dealing with the first step of that two-step process with this webinar series. It also gives you some guidance on how to actually go about getting through that process, kind of the nuts and bolts of actually getting the form submitted and in the right order and at the right time. And as always, the one thing that I want to remind people of is that a groundwater withdrawal renewal application is due 6 months prior to your application or prior to the expiration of your approval. And the submittal of an AHE or an aquifer testing plan does not satisfy that requirement. So if you're getting into the game a little bit late, please get in touch with us and we'll give you some guidance on how to get the application submitted and then follow up with an AHE or aquifer testing plan later on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Todd to go over some of the questions we have. It looks like we do have a couple of them. Todd?
Great. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Bill, for that presentation. Before we get started in the questions and answers, I'd just like to say we thank you to all the attendees for participating in today's part one of our three-part AHE process webinar series. The recording of today's webinar will be available on our website and emailed to participants in the coming days. We look forward to the next part of our webinar process, part two of the AHE process, evaluating sustainability impacts to the environment on February 24th. And please do not hesitate to reach out to commission staff with any additional questions or for more information, that may not have been covered in today's webinar. And it's really good to have those pre-application meetings so you can talk specifics on your individual projects. So I'll get to the questions here. The first question is, could a questionnaire to well owners within your area of influence satisfy the impacts to other users risk factor? So maybe Bill can just respond to that.
It can certainly be one of the lines of evidence that you submit, but in and of itself, it would not be, probably would not be sufficient. One of the things we look for is that a submittal contains an evaluation rather than just a data dump. We're looking for, the professional geologist is required to review and submit these forms. So they should include some evaluation. So that questionnaire, the results you get from that questionnaire is certainly an important data point to have in your evaluation, but the questionnaire in and of itself is not sufficient.
Great, thanks, Bill. Next question, for renewals, when do you want the AHE submitted in relation to when the groundwater withdrawal application is due? So I ask Mike to respond to that.
Ideally, it'd be submitted probably about a year before the application is due, so that we have time to review it and go back and forth and get any additional information if anything is required, and to approve the process. Because once we approve an AHE, then the groundwater withdrawal application that is associated with that AHE will become automatically available and will pre-populate some information. So that ideally, that's when it happens. If that can't happen, getting it in complete anytime before the application is due would certainly be useful. But we do have a process that we can release the application from the AHE so you don't have to do the groundwater availability analysis all over again. You don't have to complete some of the well construction information, and you don't have to tell us who you are all over again. So there's some benefit in completing portions of the AHE prior to that groundwater withdrawal application being released and being due.
Great, thanks. Next question is, please define SRBC definition of aquifer mining. And I think this, we often refer to this as groundwater mining, but maybe Mike can respond to this.
Sure. So typically what we're looking at with that is when the available recharge to the aquifer is less than the withdrawal itself, and the end result is continually declining water levels over time. So to put it simply, I'd say that's what we're looking for.
Great, thanks,
Hey,
Mike.
Todd, I would like to add a little bit onto that, though. There is a residual drawdown evaluation that is provided in Driscoll that we often utilize, and it's the T over T prime methodology, where you're using that residual drawdown to plot the intercept back to zero drawdown. And that is we use that as an indication of when groundwater mining or a limited aquifer may be present. When we say a limited aquifer, that kind of implies that there isn't sufficient resources to supply the tested rate and the tested withdrawal rate.
Great, thanks, Mike. Next question is, are sample attachments for the groundwater availability and hydrogeologic setting sections available online? And are these exercises expected to be done or completed by a practicing hydrogeologist? Mike, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I'll give it a try. I'm not sure if I entirely understand what is meant by sample attachments, but what we have available online is a table and a form in the functional sample template that people can work through so that you can look to see what is required as part of that process. And yes, a groundwater availability analysis in the hydrogeologic setting is required to be done by a licensed hydrogeologist where the state laws apply. So hopefully that's enough of an answer. If it's not, please ask a follow-up question, because I'm not 100% sure that I answered what you're asking for.
Great, thanks, Mike. The next question is, do renewal applications customarily have a pre-application conference with SRBC? And I think I'll just talk about this a little bit. And I already mentioned that, you know, those pre-application meetings are very valuable to both the commission and projects and even consultings in assisting the projects in preparing renewal applications to the commission. So we highly encourage these. It actually is included in regulation that we recommend that projects request and participate in a pre-application meeting or conference. It's good to have this pre-application meeting occur even for groundwater projects approaching renewal. I would say a couple years ahead of when the renewal application is done. That allows them some good amount of time to look at things like the risk factors, look for any data gaps. The commission can assist a little bit in looking at what data we have available for their project. We can assist in looking at the data they have. And then we may even be able to identify some data gaps even in the pre-application meeting, or things that they should look at maybe a little bit harder to see if there is a data gap. But the reason why I recommend that they be completed that early is that if the data gap is identified, it allows you time to collect data during your normal operation or during some targeted operational testing, and be able to gather that information, that data, and then prepare that in time for the renewal deadline. So I'll just look at Mike and Bill to see if they wanted to add anything to that need for a pre-application conference.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, traditionally these meetings have taken place here in our office in Harrisburg. One of the few benefits of the pandemic is that everyone's increased their capability for remote meetings. This is something that we've been doing lately for the pre-application meetings. It's a tremendous time saver for project sponsors and their consultants, not having to travel to our office for these meetings. Makes them a little easier. And like Todd said, we recommend them in pretty much all cases. It's always good for everybody to start a project with a firm understanding on what's required.
Great. And I guess the other thing I'll just add to that is we mentioned a couple of times that we do have the Public Water Supply Assistance Program. And for those projects that are public water supplies and qualify for assistance under the program, we can offer those pre-application meetings, even go a little bit further and provide some assistance in looking at the existing data and settings and risk factors. And so there are resources there and assistance that can be received through that Public Water Supply Assistance Program. So I would recommend, if you're interested in that, reaching out to Mike Appleby, and you can set up a meeting with him or his staff and talk about what may be available. So
I think the two of you pretty well covered it. The only thing I would add is that as far as those Public Water Supply Assistance Program meetings, we will actually come on site. We will come to you because part of the assistance that we are looking to provide is the development of a voluntary action plan. And the only way that we can complete something like that is to actually have been on site to see the well, to see the location, see what the environmental setting is, see if there's any groundwater users nearby, then the best place to start with that is a on-site field meeting.
Great. Thanks, Mike. And I think that's all the questions we have at this time. I'm not seeing anything else coming in. So I guess just once again, I'd just like to thank everybody for attending. Please be aware of the February 24th part 2 of this webinar series and sign up. And we look forward to that next offering. And if, like I said, if you have any questions, you can reach out to any of us on this webinar today for any follow-up questions or specific guidance for individual projects.